This past summer, we ran our first musical theater camp, and it was an awesome experience. We did The Wizard of Oz, and we had roughly 60 children come into our building here for a week, rehearse and practice and learn how to act and sing and all of the stuff that I don't understand that goes along with that. And we got to preach the gospel to these kids throughout the week, and then at the end of the week, they performed the show for the community, and we got to preach the gospel there as well, and it was wonderful. And if you are familiar with this musical, there's this main character, Dorothy is her name, and she repeats this famous line throughout the show. You probably know it. She says, "There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home." And that's true, isn't it? There's no place like home. We've all felt the wave of relief crash over us as you come home from a long day of work or school, and you're exhausted, and you plop down on the couch and you think, it is good to be home. Perhaps you felt it on vacation. Vacation is fun, but you go away for a long enough period of time, and even though you're relaxed and rejuvenated and you had a fun, enjoyable vacation, the vacation nears to an end and you start thinking to yourself, man, I can't wait to get home. There's no place like home. There's a reason that home for the holidays is an expression. Many of you just went home for the holidays and felt the warm nostalgia that only home can bring. There's a certain comfort that only comes from being in a safe environment, the safe haven that we've labeled as home. The familiar sounds and smells where even the grass and the trees feel friendlier. That's honestly part of what makes a violent or abusive, a tumultuous home life so dreadfully devastating. Because home is supposed to be where you are secure and safe, not anxious and afraid. And throughout the Bible, there's this theme of being far away from home, of wanting to return home, but not being able to. And this idea of being forced away from your home into a foreign land is what the Bible calls going into exile. And in the Bible, exile plays a huge role in the lives of God's people. If you read through the Old Testament, you find that sojourning in a foreign land, far from home, is a distressing yet dominant theme. Right? If you look at prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, exile pops up all over the place. And so for years and years, God's people are in exile in Babylon and Assyria, longing to go home, but unable to do so. Now, God is a faithful God. He always preserves a remnant. But God's people are suffering in exile in a land that does not belong to them, surrounded by gods and idols that are not their own, hemmed in by a people who do not value the way of the Lord, and besieged by a culture that is hostile toward them. Exile for God's people, and for all people in exile, is a harrowing experience. And in this grim situation, some of God's people turn away and start worshiping false gods. Some abandon the ways of the Lord and cater to the demands of the God-hating culture. And some, like Daniel, for example, live faithfully for the Lord, even in exile far from home. The theme of exile, you'll notice as you look at our passage this morning, doesn't end when God's people return to their homeland. The theme of exile doesn't even end when Jesus comes. The theme of exile continues out through the New Testament and pops up here in our text this morning. Look at what Peter calls his audience in verse 11. "Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." He calls them aliens and strangers. He calls them exiles. A later version of the NIV, the translation that's in your pews, will call them exiles, foreigners, wanderers, immigrants, refugees. In Peter's mind, Christians are exiles here on this earth, waiting to go home. Flip back to chapter 1 for a second, and look at how he opens his letter and how he addresses his audience. He says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia." Right? Peter's whole letter is written to this people group, Christians, who he sees as living in exile in this world. And if we're honest, this idea of Christians living in exile clashes with the way that most of us think about our present life situation, right? Christians are in exile, according to Peter. We often paint the picture of the Christian life that says something like this. If you work hard, live a good life, do the right things will turn out okay for you, and you'll have a pretty decent life. Right? But the Bible says, right, if Peter is correct about this exile thing, then even if you do the right thing and live a good life and live a holy life, then things could turn out very, very badly for you still. You're in exile. If you want a comfortable, cozy life, by all means, church, do not follow Jesus. We often paint the picture of America as this great Christian nation. But if Peter is correct about this, and we are in exile, then whatever earthly nation in which we currently reside will pass away. And so if Peter is correct about this, then America is not God's chosen nation. America is Babylon, and we live here temporarily in exile, awaiting our true country. So, church, if you have placed your faith in Jesus Christ, you are a citizen of heaven, in exile here on this earth. And so the big question then becomes this, right? If we are citizens of heaven, living as exiles in the earth, how then are we to live in exile? How are we to go about engaging the Babylonian culture around us, or are we to engage it at all? How do we deal with the fact that as Christians, no matter where we go in this world, we are not going to fit in? How do you make a living in exile? How do you retire in Babylon as an exile? How do you teach Babylonian children in a Babylonian public school as one who doesn't belong to Babylon? How should you sell Babylonian houses as one who is in exile in Babylon? How should you work Babylonian retail or go to Babylonian school or drive in Babylonian traffic or eat your Babylonian breakfast while in exile? And there have been all sorts of answers to this kind of basic question of how Christianity should relate to its surrounding Babylonian culture. One answer is this. I call it the silent treatment view. Have you ever given anyone the silent treatment? Right? The silent treatment is the great conflict resolution tactic of toddlers. The silent treatment view says that Christians should effectively give Babylon, the world, the silent treatment, right? They shouldn't talk to them. They shouldn't engage with them. They should separate themselves from the world. The extreme forms of this idea have Christians going away and making their own separate Christian communities so that they aren't enticed and seduced by the evil world. We see this today with certain Amish, Mennonite communities, and we see this throughout the centuries with monastic communities. Right? If you wanted to be a monk, you must forsake earthly pleasures and get your butt to a monastery so you could be more Christ-like. Right? This was the notion that many people operated on and still operate on, that the closer you wanted to be to God, the more you must isolate yourself from the world and give them the silent treatment. Now, those are extreme forms of the silent treatment idea. And I'm guessing not many of you want to be monks, but I do think that while you're not heading to the hills to a monastery, many of us still try to draw distinct boundary lines between us and the world's culture in other ways. The less extreme forms of the silent treatment idea have Christians at a summer camp throwing their rock and roll CDs into the campfire, saying, it's okay to listen to rock and roll, but it's got to be Christian rock and roll, not secular rock and roll. The logic goes like this. Christians are not at home in this world, and so they should forsake the culture of this world and make their own separate Christian culture to replace it, a sort of semi-monastic Christianization of culture. And thus emerges Christian rock bands, Christian rappers, Christian talk shows, Christian mystery novels, Christian paintings, Christian movies, Christian diet plans, Christian exercise videos, Christian t-shirts, Christian video games, Christian food chains, and on and on and on and on we could go, because Christians should isolate themselves and give the silent treatment to the world. The problem with this silent treatment idea is that Babylon's culture is not so easily escaped or Christianized. It's not so simple to take an aspect of culture, sanctify it, and thereby avoid the world's influence. We are, as exiles here in Babylon, unavoidably immersed in it. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5 that he's not saying to stop associating with unbelievers. Because if he were saying that, you'd have to go out of the world, right? If you want a genuinely Christian community, you're going to have to build one on Mars. It is impossible to cease association with Babylon. Amish men still have to purchase license plates for their horse and buggies. And if you stop shopping at every store that doesn't agree with biblical ideals, you're going to have to stop shopping altogether. True separation from the world is impossible. Another answer to the question of how Christian exiles should relate to their culture, I'm calling the middle school view. The middle school view. If you were like me in middle school, the worst thing in the world was for me to stand out. I interpreted everything through this grid of popularity. I didn't want to stand out, didn't want to cause a scene, and overall, I really did not want to be rejected. And so this desire for popularity influenced the clothes I wore, the way that I talked, the hobbies that I chose, right? Because I just wanted to be cool more than anything else in the world. And some Christians live their lives like this, right? So the middle school view says that Christians should temporarily make their home in the world. Just relax, get comfortable, live like the world, live like Babylon, kind of uncritically adopt various aspects of the culture, and life is easier. It's simpler. Again, we see this at an extreme level and then at a less extreme level, a less obvious level. At the radical level, we see oftentimes, and not all of them, but some of them, popular reality television stars, or actors and actresses, profess with their mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord, but then affirming and doing everything that the culture does. A citizen of heaven in title, but not in practice. And we see this on a less extreme level in our daily lives. It's easy to habitually drink too much on Friday and come into church on Sunday. It's easy to go to your small group and talk about Christ and the gospel and then come home and watch pornography. It's easy to just sign the inclusion statement at work that disagrees with the biblical stance on sexuality. It's easy to come to church and worship and then even here in the building, talk behind someone's back, talk about them behind their back, slander them, gossip them, and then say you were just verbally processing. And this is how some Christians live out their faith. Like middle schoolers, they will do everything within their power to fit in and look cool to Babylon, constantly trying to win Babylon's favor. And this is a lip service commitment to the citizenship of heaven, all the while bowing to the gods of Babylon. And this obviously is no way to faithfully be an exile either. So we can't remove ourselves from Babylon. The silent treatment doesn't work, and we can't become loyal citizens to it, bowing to its gods. Neither option works. Gratefully, Peter presents a third way to be an exile on this earth. A third way to live in Babylon without forsaking your heavenly citizenship. Look at our text. As aliens and strangers, he's urging them to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your souls. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. See, the silent treatment view rightly notes that we are to be separate from the world. It wrongly believes that the way to do this is to create an entirely separate Christian culture. The biblical way to be in exile in this world and be faithful is, as cliche as this is, to be in the world and not of it. In the world and not of it. We are to be in the world. We are to live such good lives among the pagans. Notice that? We are to be among the pagans. We are not to run away to the hills and create our own communities, to seclude and isolate ourselves from them. Among the pagans. Daniel still served Nebuchadnezzar while in Babylon. And yet we are not to be of the world, right? Abstaining from the sinful desires that wage war against our souls. While he worked for the king in Babylon, Daniel did not. He refused to defile himself with the king's food. And that is the kind of tightrope that we walk, in the world and not of it. And the command that Peter gives his readers in verse 12 is to live such good lives among the pagans that although they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So one of the biggest things that I've noticed, one of the biggest questions people have for me as a pastor is, how do I share the gospel with my friends? Like, how do I bring it up in conversation? And then what do I say? And it gets even harder when the person with whom you're trying to share the gospel is someone close to you, a friend or a family member, a spouse. And while Peter doesn't give us an exhaustive manual in evangelism, he gives us the first and most important step. Live holy lives. Good evangelism, church, begins with good deeds and ends with verbal proclamation. Right? This is not to say you must achieve perfection prior to evangelizing, or only Jesus would have earned the right to share the gospel, but that taking active steps toward holiness is a necessary foundation for sharing the gospel. In this way, we can even view personal growth in holiness as a part of evangelism itself. In being a pastor, one of the things I repeat to myself over and over and over and over again is this short little phrase that I've paraphrased by a Scottish minister, Robert Murray McCheyne. And he says, "The greatest thing I can do for my people is my personal holiness." The greatest thing I can do for my people is my personal holiness. Church, the greatest thing I can do for you, more important than my lesson planning or translation work or teaching youth group or mission trips or whatever else I do, the greatest thing I can do for you is my personal holiness. And it's true, right? That's why in the list of qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus 1 for pastors, guess what Paul does not list? Leadership ability. It's not there. What he does list is gentleness, self-control, sober-mindedness. It is a moral list because the greatest thing I can do for you is my own holiness. And church, the greatest thing you can do for your unbelieving friends and family and neighbors and coworkers and acquaintances, the greatest thing you can do for them is your own holiness. Peter makes this abundantly clear in verse 11. He says, "I urge you to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." And church, exile is no place to rest in the fight against sin. Notice what Peter calls it. He says, these desires wage war against your soul. He calls it a war. It's a fight. It's bloody. Your sin is waging war against you. It is trying to kill you. And therefore, exile is no place for passivity. Exile is no place to make peace with sin. Sin is glittering garbage, gold-plated dung, candy-coated poison. It brings pleasure for a moment and then death. So my encouragement to you this morning is this. In exile, kill your sin. It's a war. Ed Welch writes this about war. He says, "There's something about war that sharpens the senses. You hear a twig snap or the rustling of leaves and you're in attack mode. Someone coughs and you're ready to pull the trigger. Even after days of little to no sleep, war keeps us vigilant. And the Christian life in exile is a war. The Christian life in exile, and you won't hear me say this often, but the Christian life in exile is a violent life. It is a war. It is a battle. And who is this enemy in this exilic war that we fight? Is it Democrats? Republicans? Planned Parenthood? Tattoos? Bars? Alcohol? No. You are the enemy. Your sinful desires, says Peter, are the enemy you must kill. This is a violence against the sin within ourselves that is waging war against your souls. Christians, do not coddle your sin. Do not lie to yourself that it's under control. Enough with the just once more. Do not fall into the snare of believing that your secret sins are not hurting anyone or they're not really that big of a deal. Because sin hurts everyone. So kill your sin, and kill it now. You'd be safer going to bed tonight cuddling with a rattlesnake than you would be letting your sin live on another day. Kill it. Get violent with it. It is serious. It is a war. Kill it, strangle it, cut its throat, smother it. Do whatever it takes to murder, kill, eradicate sin from your life. I'm not a huge fan of spiders. I'm a little bit of a coward, I admit it. My wife kills more spiders around the house than I do. But every once in a while I do kill one. And when I do, and when I work up the courage to do it, perhaps she's not home or something, do you know how I do it? I roll up a piece of paper, or I grab whatever object is nearby, a shoe, a glass vase, it doesn't matter, I'm going to kill this thing, right? And then I wait for the exact right moment that the spider's not moving and I don't think it's going to jump toward me, and I strike. And when I swing, what do I do after I swing? I inspect, right? Because what if that little guy got away at the last moment that I didn't see, and now he's hiding in the corner plotting his revenge? And so I strike, and then I inspect and see if it's dead. And when I've inspected it, just for good measure, I hit it another couple times just to make sure. And then once I'm positive it's dead, I take it and I put it outside, not in the trash can in case it's one of those resurrecting spiders. I put it outside of the house and I get rid of it. But I hate spiders, and so I go to extreme lengths to kill them when they're in my house. And I can't help but think, what if we fought sin with the same intensity that I fight spiders with? What if we recognized rightly that sin is waging a war on our souls? What if we fought sin with a wartime mentality? Right? Our time in exile is a battleground, and we must kill the enemy of our own indwelling sin. Put it to death, church. Gossip, kill it. Lust, a quickness to anger, a selfish spirit, the love of money, a desire for control, pride, a tendency to see yourself higher than you ought, a disobedience toward your parents, a lack of charity toward others, an addiction to caffeine or food or television, a lazy attitude, a neglect of family. We as Christians in Babylon must diligently put these things to death if we care for our own souls and for the souls of our unbelieving friends. A life well lived in exile is a holy life. Much like killing a spider, we must first recognize that the sin is present. And that can be one of the hardest parts of this, is even seeing your own sin. And so church, get a friend or two that know you well and ask them to go hunting with you. Not in the woods. Go hunting for sin in your life. Give them a hunting license and say, you can go hunting for sin in my life, and I'm not going to get offended. Poke around in my life anywhere, because what matters to me is that I kill my sin. Find a friend or two, give them a hunting license, and then once sin is identified, blow it to smithereens. Go to extreme lengths. Jesus says, cut your hand off. Not literally, but go to extreme lengths to eradicate this sin from your life, because it is trying to kill you. And either you kill it or it will kill you. Those are the two options. You cannot let it live with you. And once it's dead, hit it again. Twice, 3 times. Make sure it never comes back. And then get somebody else to take a look at it. Show them and say, this is dead, right? And when they agree with you, take steps to make sure that it never comes back. Christian, kill your sin with everything you've got. Questions of how to preach the gospel as a public school teacher, or how to interact with Babylon's art and music or television are good, albeit complicated questions. But the most important, most basic starting point answer to those questions is this: while you are in exile, because of what Christ has done for you, live holy lives. Christ has shed too much blood for you to treat sin trivially. We are to live holy lives because, as Peter says directly before our text this morning, he starts in verse 9, he says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Church, you are God's people. You are a holy nation, chosen by God before the world's foundation. You are therefore called to be a holy nation, a nation set apart by God to live righteously, even in exile. See, Christ came once, which is what this is all about, right? We celebrate Advent, the Adventist, the coming of Jesus Christ. And he will come again. And when he comes again, he will come again to bring us home. And I mentioned before that some of you, many of you, have or still have had or still have home lives that are very, very painful. Some of you had a great home life, but came away still feeling like this underlying sadness, this feeling like you didn't fit in anywhere. A sadness that kind of stays below the surface but never seems to go away. Some of you are far from home right now. Many of you will never in this lifetime return to that place that you used to call home. But here is our hope. One day God will visit us. One day he will come again to bring us home, the second coming, to our true home, a home better, a country better than anything we could ever imagine, safer and more secure than anything we've ever experienced. One day, exile will be over for good. Heaven and earth shall become one. Every tear, every heartache, every pain of our current exilic state shall be no more. And until then, we live as foreigners, strangers, aliens, exiles in this world, in Babylon. Until then, we make war against the sin that strives to kill us. Until then, we kill our sin. Until then, we strive to live such good lives while in exile that those who see us live might glorify God on the day that he comes finally to bring us home.